Hello and welcome to this Astranti Preseen video series for the May 2019 Strategic Case Study exam on private hospital organisation Denby Healthcare. In this video series we are going to look through the entire Preseen, starting with the healthcare market and the private healthcare market in Keeland in the first video, as you can see highlighted on your screen now. The second video, we'll look more at the actual hospitals, the business models for hospitals, private hospitals within Keeland. In the third and fourth videos, we'll look more at the organisation of Denby itself, looking at its history, looking at its vision and mission statements, its strategy, how much it costs them to undertake certain procedures. In the fifth video, we'll look at the various different news stories and blog posts within the Preseen. A lot of students make the mistake of looking at these and dismissing them. And the reason for that is because there isn't always that much information contained within those particular articles, but it is a very good insight in where the examiner is leading you. The types of issues that come up in the articles are actually quite an indicator of the kinds of issues that may come up in your unseen exam. And then the sixth and seventh videos, we will look at the remainder of the Preseen from a specific P or F3 stance. So we'll be looking at the risk statement from a P3 perspective. You know, risks are very important at the strategic level. And then we'll finish by looking at the various different financial statements. And then for the final two videos, video 8 and video 9 in this particular Preseen series, we'll move away from the Preseen and look more at two specific presentations that have been created for this Preseen. One of them looks at all the various different strategic technical models that you will have learned throughout your CIMA studies, and we'll look at how they apply to Denby Healthcare and what we can read from that. And the final video looks at the top 10 most likely unseen issues. And across the Preseens, across the strategic case study exams that there have been over the last few years since the first one was introduced in March 2015, we average around 7 to 8 out of 10 for our top 10 issues. And what that means is that from our top 10 issues, 7 or 8 of those issues have arisen in the strategic case study exam across the 5 different variants in some way, shape or form. So it will be a really good insight into the kinds of issues that you may face in your exam. So before we begin the analysis, I'll just tell you a bit about who I am and also how we are going to go through this video series. So first of all, my name is Peter Steth. I am the head of strategic case study here at Astranti. I've been teaching the strategic case study since 2016, and prior to that, I taught the management and operational case study. I'm also heavily involved in writing the various mock exams that we produce for our course, and also marking those mocks as well, seeing where students are going right, seeing where they are going wrong. And I use that information to help feedback into my video analysis as well, common mistakes that students make. I've also written several of the free study texts that you can use here at Astranti. So on to the video series itself. Essentially, we're going to go through the Preseen section by section, picking out the various key points, various things that are going to be important for your exam. Also look at how real world companies, or how companies in this actual industry, obviously it's a fictional company in a fictional industry, fictional country, etc. But there are plenty of parallels with the real world, and that's what we will be tying the analysis to. So look at various key business models as well, some of the things that you will have learnt during your objective test studies, how we can apply some of those models to the case. So SWOT analysis, stakeholder matrices, and so on. We'll also look at likely exam issues that could arise, as in when we're looking through the analysis, are there particular points that they keep referring to? Is that a hint on where the examiner is thinking they may take the exam? What previous questions have come up in previous exams when this kind of information has been given, and so on. And also just key exam hints and tips as well, things to prepare you for the day, ways in which you can perhaps streamline your information, streamline the information within the pre-scene so that it helps you for the exam. Then look at the strategic analysis, our strategic analysis video, which looks at all the different models, lots of the big models, and applies them directly to the pre-scene. So we'll be looking at where the company is, where the company wants to be, and how it's going to get there using various different theories. And we'll conclude the video series by looking at the top 10 most likely issues. These will be based on previous issues that have come up in previous case studies. It will also be based on how much weight is given to particular topics, to particular things within the pre-scene. And how this actual series will work is when we're going through it section by section, I'm going to assume that we have no prior knowledge as we go through it, as in the whole point of this video series should be as if you and I were looking through the videos together, or looking through the pre-scene together. So I'm not going to act as if I've read through the entire pre-scene when I'm going through each individual page. We're going to look at it as if we're seeing everything for the first time. So we're not going to be ruling anything out at any particular stage because of what may come later in the pre-scene or what may come later in information given to us by CIMA. We're just going to assume that every single thing is relevant. We're going to assume that every single sentence is the first time that you or I have seen it, and we're analyzing it based on its own individual, mutually exclusive merits. What I suggest is that you read through a particular section and make notes, and then come back to the start of the video and we'll go through it together. And as already mentioned, at the end of the pre-scene analysis, we will then move on to the strategic analysis and top 10 most likely issues, which in a sense summarize everything that we will have done throughout the pre-scene. And as you're making notes on the pre-scene, remember this is the context for which the exam will be based. So there will be a lot of information here that perhaps won't necessarily be relevant in terms of answering the question. They're not going to be testing us on our knowledge of the pre-scene. They're not going to be testing us on things specifically in the pre-scene. It is the background information that will give us context when we are answering our questions in the exam. So if they are asking us a question on whether they should go ahead with this particular project and give us some information on that project, we will have background information on the industry, background information on the company that will allow us to pinpoint the suitability of this project based on what we know about the organization. Remember that you shouldn't be pre-writing anything based on the pre-scene. So don't assume that they're going to ask us a question on this. I'm going to write out a mock answer based entirely on this information in the pre-scene, and I'm going to ignore anything that comes up in the unseen, because remember, the unseen is the actual exam. The material given to us in the unseen should take precedence over material in the pre-scene if it contradicts. So don't write anything based on the pre-scene or pre-write anything based on the pre-scene, because it is the background information for us to deal with it. It's not the unseen, it's not the exam, it's just the background information. But saying that, we must use the information in the exam, but we must tie it back to the context of the unseen. And your recommendations must be consistent with strategic analysis. So if when we're going through our strategic analysis and we're looking at suitable projects, we're looking at suitable things for the company to undertake, if your recommendation completely flies in the face of all that analysis, it flies in the face of everything that's in the pre-scene, everything's in the unseen, then you're likely to get marked down because it is not a sensible conclusion. So let's begin our analysis looking at the first page here. Not only is it a logical place to start, but it's also very important. Students will often look at this first page and think it's just a few sentences of background information, and they'll skip straight ahead to look at the things that they perceive to be more important. They'll look at the risk statement, the financial statements, the company structure. the corporate strategy, etc. But actually there's a lot of important information in this page. And just as the pre-seen is the context for the unseen exam, this page is the context for the pre-seen itself. And there's a lot of information on here that we need to keep in mind, that we need to build upon as we move through the pre-seen. So look at the first sentence here. You are a senior manager in the finance function at Denby Healthcare, a private hospital group. Now, those of you who have read the report that CIMA published into the role in which you occupy in the strategic case study exam know that this means several different things. It means that we need to consider the risks. We need to consider the funding, the financing for everything we suggest. It also said that we need to be providing recommendations and suitable options to the board members. And you can see here that we report directly to the board. If you think about the organization in which you work, perhaps you are a board member, or perhaps you report to a board member, or perhaps you are just simply aware of the board members. But if you are reporting to the board members, you can't just give them lots of information. We're not at operational level anymore. We're not even at management level anymore. You can't just give them a wealth of information and say, make something out of that. They need you to come to them with suggestions, with options, recommendations, justified recommendations. So there's three things that we already need to keep in mind when we are answering any question in our strategic case study exam. The risks, the funding for it, and why we should go ahead with a specific option. And the examiner has actually mentioned this in their reports, that often students are not recommending. They're not coming up with a suitable conclusion. And that doesn't always have to be what the board member or whoever is asking the question in the exam is suggesting. In fact, they actually expect you to go against what is being suggested if you find enough reason, enough evidence to suggest why you shouldn't go ahead with it. So it's very important that you make sure you are playing your role in the exam. You are considering the risks for everything. That's your P3. You are considering where the funding, where the financing is going to come from. That's your F3. And that you are making those recommendations because that's specific to the role in which you are playing. And it's one of the best ways to ensure that you are giving the examiner, giving the various markers what they want from your script if you are meeting these requirements. And when we report directly to the board, we are reporting to them, advising them on special projects and strategic matters. So this is your E2 and your E3 here. I'm not saying go back and revise all of E2 because you are not specifically being tested on E2, but CIMA do consider everything that you will have learnt to this point to be assumed knowledge. So perhaps just a quick check on some specific E2 material that doesn't appear in E3 could be prudent. And so now you can see that we are looking at P3, F3 and E3 all within the same pre-seen. And this is also where you get your integration marks from. You'll remember from your OCS, from your MCS, that you've perhaps got a couple of integration marks. Well, they make up a much larger proportion of the marks in the strategic case study exam. They make up 9 out of the 100 marks. 9% of your marks come from integration. And integration is the feel of your script as a whole. It's how well you tie the different parts of the syllabus together and how fluid your answers are. And one way to ensure that you achieve the most integration marks you can is by ensuring that you play the role. Ensure that you are talking about strategy. Always consider the strategy of the organization compared with everything that you are talking about. If a project looks good from a financial perspective, it looks good from a risk management perspective, but it's completely in the opposite direction from the organization's strategy, then perhaps it isn't the right thing for the organization to be doing. They should be working towards things that ultimately help the company achieve its overall mission statement. And by integrating your knowledge of the organization's strategy, with your knowledge of risk management, with your knowledge of finance, and then concluding it effectively with a justified recommendation, you are going to set yourself up to receive a lot of integration marks, which could be the difference between you passing and failing your exam. And ultimately, that is the point of this video series. That is the point of what we are doing here at Astranti Financial Training, is we are helping you to pass your strategic case study exam to become a qualified CIMA accountant. So as you can see, that first sentence, that 2 lines and 1 word, is already really important. That is something you need to be keeping in mind whenever you are answering a question in your strategic case study exam. Then on to the second sentence, where we hear about the location of Denby Healthcare. So Denby is based in Keyland. The currency is the K dollar. Whenever you see a dollar sign or wherever you see a currency, you need to be thinking about everything from F3 that relates to finance, that relates to funding, relates to all those external influences on the value of currency. And also you need to think about inflation rates. We need to think about interest rates. How much money does Denby owe? And if interest rates increase, will that increase our finance costs to an extent that's going to be quite prohibitive to further investment? And what do we need to do to mitigate that? Do we need to look at the value of the K dollar based on other currencies around the globe? Does Denby do business overseas? Does it have hospitals in other countries, or is that a potential strategy for the future? Is Preseen Healthcare particularly renowned around the world? So, for example, if you look at the real world, the medical care in the United States is well renowned. People fly from all over the world to the United States for specialist treatment. And if so, is there scope for setting up hospitals overseas using the Denby name, using the renowned Preseen medical care as part of the marketing as well? And also, could it just be that we've been told about currencies, etc., because there is going to be a question regarding hedging? Are we going to hedge against the losses that we may feel due to adverse trading conditions? And are we going to hedge against them by using the currency market? If you look at the contents, we're going to go through the Preseen page by page, but if you look at the contents, there is an extract from a currency trader's blog in part of the articles. Now, earlier I said that the articles are a good indicator of where the examiner is heading. Well, why have we been given an extract from a currency trader's blog for a Preseen about private hospitals, unless there is some sort of indication that that could arise? So there's a potential exam issue there. A couple of potential exam issues relating to currency trading and also relating to hedging, which are key F3 topics. And I would point out that at the strategic case study level, you will not be required to do complex calculations in the same way that you were at P3 and F3. It's more from understanding hedging from a strategic perspective, how it ultimately mitigates against risk that you may suffer. So looking at the various different ways in which you combat it, such as leading or lagging payments. If there is any payment overseas, perhaps we are bringing in supplies from overseas suppliers for the various different equipments and resources that we use within our hospitals, or by invoicing in our home currency. If we have got health tourists coming from overseas to come to Keyland for specialist medical attention, how do we mitigate against any loss that we may feel in the key dollar from those overseas patients? Well, we can always invoice in our home currency. And one thing that also helps with this or aids with this and also points us in the same direction is the fact that Keyland requires companies to prepare their financial statements in accordance with the International Financial Reporting Standards. And so this actually makes it easier to do business overseas, whether that is business coming from overseas to Keyland or from Keyland out overseas. because all the different countries that sign up to the International Financial Reporting Standards will use these same methods, and that means it's easier to do reporting, do your financial reports across overseas markets. Denby is also quoted on the Keyland Stock Exchange, an active and well-regulated exchange. So we know that we are a public company, and therefore we can perhaps raise additional finance on the stock market. It may also mean that we are more prestigious when we are looking for the top talent to staff our hospitals. We have the fact that we are a public entity, and therefore we have more prestigious, or there's a prestige to working at Denby because it's such a large organization. So we've also got a couple of stakeholders that we've identified there. If we are quoted on the Keyland Stock Exchange, we will have shareholders who need to be appeased, and that may affect how we operate. When you have shareholders who expect a return, sometimes you cannot leverage short-term profit for long-term sustainability because they want their profit, they want their dividends. And on top of that stakeholder that we've identified there in shareholders, we've also identified that staff are important already, because we're speaking about how prestigious it is to be a public company. We're speaking about the fact that we are a private hospital group, therefore we will need high quality, well-trained staff to staff our hospitals. Because if you think about what a private hospital is, a private hospital needs to at least be as good, and ideally better, and to be really successful, a lot better than the public hospitals, that are funded by the state. So we need to have the better quality doctors, the better quality nurses, the better quality specialists, the better machines, the better porters. Everyone and everything that makes a hospital needs to be better than the state-funded ones if we are going to survive as a private hospital. And so you could also say, or we could also argue, that having high quality staff is an important success factor to the organization. Keyland also requires companies to adhere to the Code of Corporate Governance, which is all about how organizations should be run and administered to the best possible extent for all stakeholders involved. So no one particular stakeholder is being picked over another. So to stop instances where companies are being run just for the shareholders and not with any mind for the various individuals who work for the organization, or to stop the agency problem where you have directors who are trying to get the best possible profit for a particular year to receive their bonuses before moving on to another organization and then leaving the company in tatters, and that ultimately affecting the employees there, affecting the consumers, the customers, the patients in our example here, and also the shareholders who are left with a failing organization. An important model for us to consider when looking at the Keyland Code of Corporate Governance is the UK Code of Governance, and whilst we cannot say for definite whether they are the same at the moment, it would be a good starting point. I'm sure you're all very familiar with the UK Code of Governance, as it makes up a substantial part of your P3 study. And before we move on, just want to summarise what we have looked at so far, and also to look at what the organisation, the kind of organisation we are analysing actually is. And it's a private hospital group. And in the UK, there are two very, very similar organisations which share a lot of similarities with Denby, and those are the Nuffield Healthcare Group and the Spire Healthcare Group. So those would be a good couple of organisations to look at when you are looking for extra industry background information, which the examiner has said is also incredibly important to your success at the strategic case study level. It also gives us an insight into the kinds of customers that this organization would have. So with a private medical group, generally we would have customers paying for their own treatment. often this is done through private medical insurance companies, companies like Bupa in the UK. And vicariously through that, we then have to think about who actually signs up to private medical insurance. A lot of these are organizations, large organizations that offer private healthcare as a perk, as part of their job. So we need to think about organizations as well, and that are going to sign up with private medical insurance companies that will then send business through our private hospitals. And we have to think about the cost involved when we are thinking about that, because remember, an insurance company is going to send the various different clients that it has to the hospitals that are going to be most cost effective, because it's costing the insurance company. So we have to remain competitive with other private medical hospitals, otherwise we're going to lose some of that insurance business. And also, if we think again about the UK, we think about Nuffield Health, we think about Spire, a lot of business through private hospitals is actually outsourced by the National Health Service. National Health Service is in not necessarily a huge crisis, but it always has more need than it can fulfill. More people need the NHS than it can fulfill. And therefore, it outsources some of its contracts, some of its operations, some of its surgeries, etc. to private healthcare companies, because whilst it may not be the most efficient way in the long run, it is a way in which they can deal with the backlog of surgeries, the backlog of operations, the backlog of patient needs. So we've got three big customers there: the health service, private medical insurance companies, and individuals paying for their own treatment. And with all of that in mind, let's move on to the second page of the Preseen now and look at healthcare in Keyland. We can see here that Keyland is a developed and prosperous country where employment levels are high and employers are required to pay a sufficient hourly rate. So based on what we discussed on the previous page, there's already some relevant information here. A developed and prosperous country, likely to have a well-rounded, well-funded a national health system. And we can actually see that they confirm this here. The government provides extensive healthcare through the Keyland Health Service. Also, employment levels are high and it's a prosperous and developed country. So it's going to have large organizations, wealthy organizations. So going back to what I was saying about companies offering private medical insurance as a perk of the job. So there are two things here that fulfill those speculations that we made on the previous page. So when we're looking at where our revenue is going to be generated, who is going to be using our private hospitals, we've got wealthy companies and potentially well-off individuals, and we've also got a national health service that may send business, outsource business through to our private hospitals. But whilst the Keyland Health Service may represent an opportunity for outsourced business, it also represents a huge competitor. So a large proportion of individuals are perhaps not likely to want to pay for their medical treatment when they can receive it free on the KHS. And so you could argue that Denby are almost fighting a losing battle when you've got this well-funded and free service. But what they can do to ensure that they do receive a certain amount of service still is to ensure that they are differentiated from the National Health Service. And the Preseen goes on to talk about how the National Health Service in Keyland, the Keyland Health Service, is run. So every citizen is registered with a GP and they are responsible for routine treatment, and they can provide them with a recommendation to go and see a specialist in a hospital. And in fact, before the patient can go to receive treatment, they must go through their GP. They are not permitted to treat patients without a referral from the GP. And this can perhaps be inefficient in that if you have, or a patient has, a condition and they know they need to go and see a specialist, they know that they need treatment, they have to go to the GP then has to provide them with a referral, then they have to arrange the appointment with the specialist through the referral. And perhaps one way in which Denby, as a private healthcare organisation, can differentiate themselves here is looking at the way in which they operate. Perhaps there is a way to improve on the inefficiency of this system by offering patients the chance to directly consult a specialist in a very quick phone call, perhaps, before deciding whether or not they need to see them for an actual consultation. Hospitals also offer both inpatient and outpatient surgeries, and it explains the differences between them. Inpatients are admitted to the hospital and required at least one overnight stay, subject to constant medical supervision, whereas outpatients generally do not stay overnight. And both inpatients and outpatients may require the use of many different machines and also require to undergo many different tests on blood, tests on urine, whatever it may be, including X-rays, ultrasound machines, and magnetic resonance imaging, otherwise known as MRI scans. What this does indicate here, what this is an illustration of, is the sheer cost involved in medical treatment. It's not something that you're just going to be able to pay out of the loose change in the back of your pocket, unless you have very, very deep pockets. Because if you think about accommodation, you think about the cost of these machines, you think about the cost of medical supervision by several different doctors, all of whom may be on quite high salaries, that is a huge cost involved. And so the costs of running a private hospital or a public hospital in terms of the KHS are likely to be very high. So costs will be high. That's something that we need to consider, something that we need to keep in mind. We also have to think about technology as well when we're thinking about our Pestel analysis, our external analysis, always ensuring that we have the best possible machines. Here it mentions that we need to do things such as X-rays, ultrasounds, MRI scans. All of these things are very, very expensive. MRI machines can cost hundreds of thousands of pounds in the real world. And we have to ensure that we have the best possible machine for it. Because if we are a private hospital, we have to be better than the public services. Otherwise, there's no reason why anyone would use us if it costs them more money and we don't provide a better service. So we always have to be at the cutting edge of technology, have the best possible machines with the best possible results, the best possible chances of recovery or reduced recovery times. So when we're thinking about our external analysis, we need to think about technology, ensure that we are always at the forefront of technology using the best possible machines. And in addition to scheduled services such as inpatient and outpatients, they also offer accident and emergency facilities, otherwise known as A&E. And in an emergency, patients go to the directly to the nearest hospital, either through their own transport or through an ambulance service, and they will evaluate the condition and provide immediate treatment. Or if it is something that doesn't need to be treated there and then, they send them home and ask them to come back in as an inpatient at a later time. And citizens are not required to pay for treatment on the KHS. Not at all. That's different from the NHS, where generally a lot of the surgeries provided, a lot of the consultations, anything with your GP is free. One thing that is not free on the NHS in the real world is prescriptions. You have to pay for your prescriptions unless you are eligible for free prescriptions. But all this goes to show, or to back up what I was talking about earlier, that for a private hospital to be successful, it needs to be better than the public health service. Because if the public health service is free to use and of a certain quality, individuals or insurance companies won't be willing to pay extra for something that is not justifiably better. But a couple more external analysis things to mention now. That the KHS is funded by tax revenues, and the Keelan government spends a large proportion of its revenues funding the KHS. We need to think about economics. If there is less tax being generated, if there is a recession and there's less tax being generated, if there is austerity, as there has been in the UK for many years under the current government, that can cause a lack of funding in the National Health Service, and that leads to poorer performance. It leads to a potential rise in the amount of individuals moving towards private treatment. And so if the government as well decides to invest more in the health service, to invest more in the KHS, that could have a negative effect on the amount of individuals, the amount of insurance companies sending people through private medical insurance, because the KHS would be more funded and therefore be providing a higher level of service. So again, another external analysis, another that can have an impact on our business. That's what I'm going to be looking at throughout this section, the section on healthcare and also the private healthcare market. It's not specifically referencing Denby at the moment, but we are painting a picture of the environment in which we operate and how that is going to have an impact on us. And despite the continuous investment in the KHS, constantly resources do not meet demand. And this is for various reasons, such as medical research, which is continually yielding advances in preventative medicine, but it requires additional investment. It requires a lot more investment than actually the payoff that is received. But it is imperative that this public body does continue to invest in research, because that is critical to the general populace and to improving the medical field as a whole. And it could be argued that it's an ethical issue here that private companies perhaps do not invest as much in research and development into preventative medicines, into preventative medical techniques. They rely on the underfunded National Health Services to invest in that, and then they take off the overspill from all those appointments, from all those treatments that the National Health Service can't meet. And so that could be considered an ethical issue. Although it could be argued that it's also helpful because the private medical industry is picking up the slack, allowing the National Health Services to invest in the research and development that private hospitals perhaps do not undertake because it is not always lucrative from a commercial perspective. And the theme of ethics is also mirrored in the third point here, where the KHS is the only source for critically ill or extremely ill patients whose survival may depend on intensive care. And the reason why private hospitals may not undertake this is because it can be very difficult to budget for, it can be very difficult to speculate. You don't know who's going to be coming in for emergency treatment or what they're going to be coming in for emergency treatment for. And so it doesn't make commercial sense for a private organisation to have intensive care units or to have A&E departments. But again, it goes back to whether that is an ethical issue. Should medical treatment be a for-profit business? Is it fair for private medical institutions to make money, take business away from the National Health Service, and expect them to pick up all the different treatments that aren't profitable enough for them to perform? But again, the flip side of that is, isn't that the point of a public body? Is it's not supposed to be for profit. It's supposed to do the things that perhaps don't make commercial sense, but are just correct from an ethical sense, and allow the private entities to do the commercial surgeries, the commercial procedures. And because of all of this, there are often strains on the KHS, strains on the health service, with some patients often having to wait for several weeks or even months for treatment. And so it's no surprise, particularly for these sorts of patients, that they may consider moving to private healthcare, particularly if their condition would cure, or the thing that they need curing is painful or debilitating. And again, we have issues here with the government that's been accused of underfunding the KHS. And as a result of this, they implemented a mandatory 15-week period in which to treat all ailments. But whilst there is no formal penalty for this, often hospitals have their budgets reduced in favour of more efficient hospitals. And it's during this time that the KHS hospitals may choose to outsource the treatment to private healthcare in order to meet their requirements, to meet that mandatory 15-week period. So here we have an example of where the government has perhaps underfunded the NHS or the KHS, but as a result, it's beneficial to Denby Healthcare. It's beneficial to private healthcare because it provides an opportunity for Denby to take some of that KHS treatment and to receive payment from it. However, because this is a political issue that has a direct impact, there's often elections, and so there is the chance for that to change. For example, if a new government in their campaigns that they're going to fund the KHS a lot more, then that could affect Denby. If that government gets elected and starts pumping a lot more money into the KHS, that starts alleviating some of the problems that the KHS has had, that may reduce the amount of business that is being sent towards Denby. And if the overall KHS improves, if the wait times improves, if the quality of treatment improves, then that's going to be a lot less opportunity for Denby, because if the treatment that the patient can receive for free is of a very, very high standard and done very quickly, there'll be no need for them to seek treatment elsewhere. Now let's look at the private healthcare markets. And of course, we know that the citizens of Keeland pay for the KHS through taxation, so there's no need for them to make a separate payment. But there is a significant demand for private healthcare still, for many of the reasons that we have already stated. But the Preseen is going to go on and tell us the specific reasons why there is demand. And often, one thing that separates private healthcare from the KHS is same-day consultation. So ringing up and saying, I need to come and see my GP, and then going off and doing it, rather than ringing up your GP and saying, well, we can see you in 4 weeks' time. Well, that's not going to be any help if you need treatment now, if you really need to get your referral, if you really need to get a prescription. So there's a reason already there. The convenience of it, the effectiveness of it is a reason why an individual may choose to go private than use the KHS. And that's also one of the main reasons that the Preseen has given as well, that generally private healthcare is far more responsive, consultations are far shorter, and may be available outside working hours. That's a good point here about outside normal working hours. You don't want to have to spend your precious annual leave going to doctor's appointments. So having a healthcare service that you can visit at 7, 8 o'clock at night after you finish work might be preferable. You might be willing to pay extra for that, particularly if you do not get paid for leave that you take. Then it would actually be costing you money to go and see the KHS specialist, even if you are not paying to see them. Whereas you can actually go to work and then go and see your GP afterwards if you are using a private healthcare service. And that's also a way in which Denby can differentiate themselves not from just the KHS, but also from other private medical companies. If other private companies do not offer outside of working hours, it could be a way in which they differentiate themselves. Private hospitals also offer a different level of treatment, be it better and improved care for the same ailment or different ailments. For example, here, patients may seek private treatment for things like facelifts, Plastic surgery is the general term for all kinds of cosmetic surgery, and often it's not justified on the KHS because it's purely cosmetic. It's not going to help anyone, improve anyone's quality of life, and therefore it is unavailable on the KHS. Also, by using more advanced equipment, which goes back to something that I was mentioning earlier about always being on the cusp of cutting-edge technology here, can actually as well help differentiate the private healthcare sector from the public healthcare sector. Using the best technology, providing the best possible results, will differentiate itself, will give people due cause to leave the free public health system and come to the private system. Comfort as well. This may sound like something that is a bit soft. It's not perhaps going to be a real tangible reason as to why you would choose to use a private healthcare. But then when you think about how mentally being in somewhere where it's more comfortable, being in somewhere which is more relaxed, could be very beneficial to your recovery. And therefore, one of the reasons that private healthcare systems may be the preferred choice for some patients, particularly patients who are able to pay for it, is that they are far more luxurious. They might be individual rooms, they may have far better food, far nicer linens, far better quality of beds, very nice spacious room that resembles a hotel, as they have mentioned here, albeit with all the equipment required to monitor the patient's health. So again, another way in which Denby needs to compete. We're looking at how, rather than how Denby would compete with the KHS now, we're looking at how Denby would compete with other private medical hospitals. Why would a patient come to a private hospital, and what is going to affect their decision of which hospital to go to? We know that patients choose private hospitals because of better quality rooms, because they're more comfortable. Therefore, we know when Denby is trying to advertise itself, trying to market itself, this is one of the reasons or one of the ways in which they can differentiate themselves, why they can appeal to the patient who is willing to pay for their medical treatment, why you would come to Denby rather than going to another private hospital. And a point here about citizenship as well, that the KHS will only treat foreign visitors in an emergency and will charge them for consultations or treatment. So, people who are coming from overseas to Kieland for treatment will not be able to have decent care on the KHS without paying for it. So, as a result, they will have to go to a private healthcare anyway, unless it's an emergency. Therefore, there's a good opportunity, particularly given the Kieland reputation, both in the public and private sectors, there's a good opportunity here for Denby to get business from overseas. And that's another reason why there could be a potential opportunity for overseas hospital here. If people are coming all the way to Kieland for treatment, if there's a particular country which has a very large population, a wealthy population, but has a poorer medical record, and they're all coming to Kieland for treatment, why not set up a Denby hospital in that location? It also goes back to what I was saying earlier about the strength of the K-dollar, the relevance of the fact that there is a K-dollar, the relevance of currency fluctuations, and also that article that we were presented in the pre-scene, or we at least have seen in the table of contents about currency trading, that there could be a potential issue surrounding currencies. And the big differences between private hospitals, other than those that we have already mentioned, and the KHS, is that there is no A&E service, nor is there intensive care or high dependency units. And the reason for this is because they are difficult to budget for. The reason for this is because they are very expensive. They have to be running 24 hours a day, every day of the year, and also we will not know which particular specialist will be needed at particular times. And so therefore, it's actually better for us at Denby Healthcare in the private healthcare service to leave that to the Keyland Health Services. It's not a commercially viable practice. So if you are presented with such a question in the exam asking about whether or not we should start our own high dependency unit, whether we should have our A&E department or create an A&E department, it's not going to be commercially viable. The final couple paragraphs we look at in this first video are at the top of this next page here, where it states that both KHS and private hospitals require patients to be referred for consultation by GPs. So earlier when I suggested that a way in which they could differentiate themselves would be a more direct access to treatment, we now know that in the private healthcare field that is currently not the case, and therefore is there opportunity to differentiate ourselves. Again, it's another theme that I'm coming back to, all ways in which Denby could differentiate themselves and therefore improve the level of service, improve the service provided to the patients, improve the patient's perception of the private healthcare service, and thus retain more business in private healthcare. And finally, confirmation that the KHS is a major user of private healthcare, which we have been speculating throughout this video. And that is a big threat. If the KHS was funded more effectively, if they didn't have to worry so much about this 15-week deadline, then they wouldn't be sending as much treatment through private hospitals. So from a commercial point of view, more funding to the KHS might actually be a bad thing for private hospitals. So that brings us to the end of the first video, and you can see already just by looking at the general private healthcare market, looking at the general state of play for health and medical needs within Keyland, and of course looking at this first page again where we looked at the role in which we were playing and the background information for Denby themselves, how we can already see a lot of information that is going to help us as we analyze the rest of the Preseen and as we enter the exam itself. We've already got an idea of the kinds of customers that Denby has, whether it's individuals, insurance companies, national health services. We've seen how the KHS, the National Health Service within Keyland, is both a competitor and a customer of us, and what impacts may, or what things can impact that, and whether that will continue, whether that will get better. And if a new government comes in and invests more money in the Keyland Health Service, will we lose the Keyland Health Service as a major customer? So that's political fields, political things that could affect our organization. To think about economics, the fact that the company is, or the country of Keyland is a prosperous country with a lot of wealth, means that there is an opportunity for private healthcare. If there were a recession, that could cause problems. We need to think about social aspects as well. What do people think about private healthcare? Is it seen as something that is ethical? Is it seen as something that's unethical? Is it seen as something that is actually quite beneficial? And therefore that will impact how many people come to private healthcare. Technology, we've seen that we need to be the best company to take business from the KHS in order to give people a reason to come to private healthcare rather than use the KHS. You need to invest in the best technology. So again, using your greater environmental analysis, your pest analysis, we've already seen quite a few issues as well. And a couple more things to round off the pest analysis. At a hospital, we're going to be dealing with a lot of waste. It could be things potentially infectious and therefore needs to be disposed of properly in a way that doesn't damage the environment. And also L for law, legal liabilities. The medical field is plagued with legal responsibility and doctors and hospitals being sued for mistreatment. And that's particularly important when we are a private organisation, because there will be a perception that we're doing things for profit, we're doing things to make as much money as possible. And if that leads to poor quality treatment, that leads to a person's death or a serious injury or serious illness as a result of poor treatment, there's going to be a legal responsibility for that. And that will lead to a damage in the organization's reputation. And reputation will mean a lot in this industry, because if you're going to advertise yourselves as a private healthcare company, we're going to charge people to make them better rather than them going and using the free KHS. You've got to show that you are worth paying for. If there's a chance that you might actually receive worse treatment than you would on the free KHS, no one is going to want to come to Denby Healthcare. So reputation and therefore legal liability is also incredibly important. So thank you for watching this video. I hope you have enjoyed it, and more importantly, you have found it useful. I'd like to finish by just telling you a few things about the products that we produce here at Astranti and the ones that are part of our course. So these materials can all be purchased as part of the course or purchased individually. So we have our study text. We have 3 study texts for all the objective test exams. So 3 study texts for E1, P1, F2, F3, etc. But we also have the study text specifically for the case study exams, split into 2 parts. The first is about how to approach the exam, how to analyze the information, how to plan your answers, how to write your answers, and also the second part, which looks at the key theories from the objective test levels that are relevant to the particular case study. So if you are looking at P2, F2, E2 for the management exam, F3, P3, E3 for the strategic case study exam, and so on. We have our course videos, which look at how to plan your answers, how to manage your time effectively. These are the key reasons why people fail the exam. We have our Preseen Analysis, which looks at the Preseen in a lot of depth, applies key information to that, and also concludes with the strategic analysis, where we look at the various different models in the CIMA syllabus and apply them to the case, and also the top 10 most likely issues to arise in your exam. Generally, we have a 70 to 80% accuracy rate on our top 10 issues. Our industry pack, which details in great depth the history and the current contemporary issues within the particular industry that the Preseen is based on. We also have 20 to 25 industry examples that you can use within your answers. We have mock exams that can be purchased with or without marking and feedback, where you can get some real exam practice in, look for the kinds of things that the examiner is going to bring up in the exam, and also get marking and feedback from expert markers who have marked for CIMA and for us for many years, who know exactly the kind of things that the examiner is looking for, exactly the kinds of mistakes that students often make, and can provide lots of detailed feedback to ensure that you improve on your performance. We also have our master classes, which are 2 day-long classes which look at all the key issues facing students in the exam. We will also go through live planning, showing you how to plan your answers effectively, how to write your answers effectively. Again, key things that cause people to fail the strategic case study exam, or any of the case study exams for that matter. And also, if you do sign up for our course, provided that you have filled out your forms, provided that you have submitted your mocks, provided you have done everything to show that you have really given it your all to try and pass this exam, we also offer a pass guarantee, giving a free resit to anyone who fails the exam.